Hercule Poirot investigates a collector's murder and finds the truth hidden in an antique globe, a vanished map, the killer's prints, and a motive of greed. Chapter 1. The inciting incident. Grand Hotel de la Ville, nestled at the edge of a secluded Italian lakeside village, had seen its fair share of affluent guests over the years. It was a sanctuary for the rich and famous, those seeking tranquility amid beauty. Yet today, the air was thick with tension, far from the calm that the place typically exuded. The guests had gathered for the evening's grand gala, an opulent affair celebrating the hotel's anniversary. The ballroom glittered with gold and crystal, the air rich with perfume, the soft melodies of a string quartet lulling the crowd into a false sense of serenity. But that serenity was about to be shattered at precisely 10 o'clock. Amidst the gentle clinking of champagne glasses and the soft laughter of aristocrats, a sharp, unmistakable cry cut through the din, a high-pitched, breathless scream that came from the direction of the hotel's antique library. Within moments, the party turned to chaos, the music ceasing, whispers spreading like wildfire. In a matter of seconds, the guests had parted into a few gathered at the edges of the ballroom, too shocked to move, others rushing to the source of the disturbance. When they arrived, they found a scene that no one could have anticipated. In the midst of the lavish room filled with towering shelves of ancient books, a figure lay sprawled across the floor, a man, seemingly mid-30s, with jet-black hair now darkened by blood. His body lay twisted near an old wooden globe, its brass frame gleaming ominously under the warm lighting. His left hand clutched a scrap of paper, but it was too smeared with blood to read. Good God, it's Henry Blythe. One of the guests whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the body. Henry Blythe, an English financier with a reputation for shady dealings and whispers of dark secrets, had always been a curious presence at the hotel. He was known for his charm, his sharp wit, and his ability to weave his way through conversations like a skilled diplomat. Yet, even among his many admirers, there were those who said his eyes had an unnerving edge to them, a hint of secrets kept just out of reach. The authorities were swiftly notified, and within minutes, a local constable arrived, flanked by the hotel's general manager, who was visibly sweating in the wake of the tragedy. They were joined by a few of the more authoritative guests, but it was clear that no one had the first clue as to what had transpired. Amid the growing panic, one person stood apart from the rest, a tall, poised figure, sharply dressed in a suit that seemed far too formal for such a chaotic scene. Hercule Poirot. He had arrived just earlier that evening, as a guest invited by an old friend, but now, he seemed to have become a necessary fixture of the scene. His piercing gaze scanning the room with calm precision, Poirot stepped forward, his keen eyes noting every detail, from the position of the body to the placement of objects in the room. He made his way past the agitated crowd and knelt beside the body, noting the signs of a quick and violent death. No struggle, no defensive marks. Fascinating, Poirot murmured to himself, his fingers lightly brushing the antique globe that the victim had fallen near. A man who had everything, yet none of it mattered. The guests watched in awe as Poirot circled the body with deliberate care. "Is there anything you can tell us, Monsieur Poirot?" the manager asked, his voice wavering with the weight of the moment. Poirot's lips parted in a delicate smile. "Ah, my dear fellow, that is what I intend to discover." He glanced toward the body again, focusing on the fingers clenched around the paper. "But first, we must see what Mr. Blythe left for us." Gently, Poirot retrieved the paper from the victim's hand, careful not to disturb any of the surrounding evidence. As he unrolled the damp, bloodied scrap, the other guests leaned in, curious, but Poirot's face remained a mask as he read the hastily scrawled words. "The globe. Find it before it's too late." Poirot's eyes narrowed. The clue was cryptic, yet precise in its urgency. It was clear that the globe, this seemingly innocuous object, held some significance. A simple piece of antique furniture, yet now it was at the heart of this bizarre and fatal mystery. The rest of the guests looked on in confusion, but Poirot said nothing. He turned toward the manager, his voice soft but deliberate. "Leave everything as it is. No one may enter this room again until I give the word." With that, he turned to face the crowd, his eyes scanning their faces, noting every subtle shift in their expressions. And so, the investigation began. Within this grand hotel, in the midst of glittering gowns and evening jackets, Poirot had begun his work. The game had started, and the clock was ticking. Each suspect, whether they knew it or not, was now a piece on a chessboard that Poirot would carefully and deliberately maneuver until the truth was exposed. "Do not worry, mon ami," Poirot said with a gleam in his eye, addressing the bewildered group. "I shall unravel this, with patience, with care, and with a little help from the little gray cells." Chapter 2. The first closed room was silent now, save for the quiet murmurs of the guests lingering just outside the threshold. Their unease was palpable, their eyes darting between each other as Poirot stood motionless, observing the scene. In the corner of the room, the brass globe gleamed under the light, innocent and still. Its antique frame, decorated with intricate carvings, appeared almost out of place next to the modern surroundings of the Grand Hotel. But Poirot knew better than to be distracted by such things. Everything in this room had its significance, no matter how trivial it appeared at first glance. Poirot stood up and motioned for the local constable, a stout man with a nervous disposition, to step forward. What do we know about the victim, monsieur?" Poirot asked, his voice calm yet sharp, a tone that brooked no hesitation. "Henry Blythe." The constable answered, his hand trembling as he fumbled with his notebook. "A financier. Stayed here frequently, usually alone. Some say he's a bit of a mysterious man. No family, no close friends." His eyes shifted toward the door. "And he's dead. Stabbed, I believe." Poirot's eyes flicked to the body again. Not quite a stabbing, I think," he murmured. "No blood splatter, no sign of a violent struggle. But the knife, or whatever instrument was used, must have been precise, no?" The constable blinked. "You think it wasn't a random act?" Poirot's gaze fell on the faint line of red on the victim's collar, then moved to the neatly pressed cuffs. "Not random, no. He was not attacked in a frenzy. Someone knew exactly where to strike." His words hung in the air as Poirot's eyes swept the room. He moved toward the bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines of the antique volumes with a quiet precision. "Did anyone disturb the scene before I arrived?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The constable hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "Well, a few of the staff came in, but they didn't touch anything, just saw the body. We thought it best to wait for you." Poirot nodded, but something caught his eye. He stepped toward a small side table where a few sheets of paper were scattered. One sheet was slightly crumpled, the edges torn, as though someone had hastily discarded it. Poirot picked it up carefully, inspecting the faint ink that was smeared across its surface. "Mon ami," he said, his voice a soft murmur of intrigue. "Tell me, where was the victim last seen before the incident?" The constable frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. He was at the bar, talking to a couple of the guests, but nothing seemed unusual, not until we heard the scream. Poirot's gaze sharpened. He turned toward the guests who had remained near the door. Was anyone in here with him before the crime occurred? There was a shift in the crowd. A few people looked away. A couple shuffled their feet nervously. Poirot noted their behavior immediately, his eyes narrowing. "No, of course not," he said. Everyone was far too busy socializing. He moved back to the center of the room, his eyes flicking to the small desk by the window. Upon it lay an open letter, its corners slightly curled, as if it had been left in a hurry. Poirot moved to it and read the faint scribble on the edge of the envelope. It was only half legible, but the word globe stood out clearly. Poirot's fingers hovered over the letter, a thin line of concentration on his face. The word globe seemed like an innocuous clue, but Poirot knew better than to dismiss such things so quickly. Something about this letter, its hasty abandonment. The faint ink, it was almost as if the writer had intended to hide it. Ah, but what is this? Poirot muttered, bending slightly to examine the letter's contents more carefully. He was meticulous, a trait he held dear, and as he read the lines once more, something clicked in his mind. There was a mention of a scheduled meeting, something urgent. It was enough to suggest that Blythe's death hadn't been an isolated incident. Someone was involved, someone who had a great deal to gain from Blythe's death. But who? Poirot stood, his gaze sweeping over the room, before falling once again on the antique globe. The clue had to be there. Perhaps it wasn't just a piece of furniture after all. With careful precision, he walked toward it, his movements deliberate. He gently pressed his fingers against the globe's surface, feeling for any hidden mechanism, any small sign of disturbance. His fingers brushed over the brass, the polished surface smooth under his touch, until a faint click echoed in the room. Poirot's eyes lit up, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The globe turned slightly, revealing a small, concealed compartment. Inside, nestled within the folds of velvet, lay a single, pristine document untouched. Unlike the rest of the room's chaos, with a measured hand, Poirot retrieved it, scanning the contents quickly. His expression remained unchanged, but his mind was already racing. The document contained instructions, cryptic instructions, but it also had a name, one that had not yet surfaced in the investigation, a name Poirot realized that was bound to turn this case on its head. As Poirot rose from the globe, he turned back to the constable, his voice steady but with an air of finality. "We have much more to uncover, monsieur. Much more." The game was afoot, and Poirot's little gray cells were already in overdrive. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects. The atmosphere in the Grand Hotel de la Ville had shifted. What had once been a place of opulence and leisure was now a chamber of suspicion and fear. Guests who had once mingled with ease were now whispering nervously, casting furtive glances as they huddled in tight knots around the ballroom. The excitement of the evening had all but dissipated, replaced by a tense, suffocating air. Poirot stood in the center of the grand hall, carefully studying the scene. His eyes scanned the faces of the remaining guests, each of them a potential key to solving the mystery. His sharp mind was already drawing connections, piecing together the puzzle with deliberate precision. He was no stranger to murder and misdirection, and already he could see how tangled the web was. It was time for the suspects to be gathered. The constable hesitated, but knew that Poirot's presence commanded respect, even in such dire circumstances. "Monsieur Poirot," the constable said, his voice strained, "we've gathered the guests who were in the hotel at the time of the incident. We thought it best to keep them in one place." Poirot nodded and gestured for the group to enter. The group of suspects filed into the ballroom, each person stepping carefully as though they were unsure whether to speak or remain silent. There were 12 of them in total, each one observing the other with an air of nervous curiosity, not unlike animals at a watering hole, wary of the predator among them. Poirot stood, arms folded, his eyes narrowing as he took in each individual. The first to enter was the manager, Mr. Alfonso Montelli, a tall man with a slight stoop and a perpetual furrow in his brow. His usually immaculate appearance was now slightly disheveled, as if the events of the evening had unsettled his typically composed demeanor. He was followed by Mrs. Beatrice Forsyth, an elegant woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair and a sharp, hawkish gaze that didn't seem to miss a thing. Then came Richard Devereux, A stocky man in his 40s, with a thick accent and a quick temper. His expensive suit looked as if it were tailored just that morning, yet his face wore an expression of genuine concern. Was it worry for the crime? Or was it fear of being found out? Next, there was Clara Vandenberg, an aloof woman with a soft smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her delicate hands fidgeted with a strand of pearls, a nervous tic that Poirot had already noticed. The others followed, some familiar, some strangers, but each bore an expression that, while masking their thoughts, revealed their own hidden anxieties. Some were acting like they had nothing to hide. Others, like the young heiress Vanessa Collins, stood stiffly, her eyes darting between Poirot and the other guests, as though trying to read their reactions. Vanessa had been seen talking to Blythe earlier that evening, but did she have anything to do with his death? Poirot's mind ticked like a clock as he regarded each individual. He didn't need to hear their stories just yet. He had already learned more from their body language and their first reactions than most detectives could learn in hours of questioning. But it was time to get to work. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room once more. Ladies and gentlemen, I trust you are all familiar with the reason for your gathering. I ask that you refrain from speaking out of turn. I have only a few questions for each of you, but I will allow you to speak freely once I have heard your responses. You may feel free to share what you know, but remember, any falsehoods or attempts to mislead me will only prolong this unfortunate affair. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but nodded silently. Poirot began his questioning with the manager, Montelli, who seemed to have the most to lose. Mr. Montelli, you were the first on the scene, I presume? Poirot began, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Montelli's jaw tightened. Yes, Monsieur Poirot. I arrived as soon as I heard the scream. It was a terrible shock, Mr. Blythe. He was such a regular guest here. His words seemed rehearsed, carefully measured. Poirot studied his face for a moment longer than necessary, noting the subtle twitch of his right eye. And how did you find the room? Poirot asked, his tone soft but probing. It was, as you saw, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing was touched. I made sure no one entered until the authorities arrived, Montelli replied. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes. It was most prudent of you. But what about the others? Were you aware of anyone in the hotel who had an unusual connection to Mr. Blythe? Perhaps a financial interest? A personal issue? Montelli hesitated, his lips pursing. I cannot say, Monsieur Poirot. Mr. Blythe kept to himself for the most part, but I know that some of the guests here are involved in various financial ventures. I would not be surprised if there were complications, you understand. Poirot raised an eyebrow. The answer was vague, but there was a sense of caution in Montelli's words that spoke volumes. Poirot filed it away for later. Next, Poirot turned his attention to Mrs. Forsyth, who had been quiet but watchful throughout Montelli's questioning. Madame Forsyth, Poirot said, his gaze softening slightly. I trust you did not find the news of Mr. Blythe's death too upsetting. The older woman's lips twitched as she met his eyes. I find death to be an unfortunate but inevitable part of life, Monsieur Poirot, she replied coolly, her voice laced with an icy detachment. Of course, it's always tragic when it happens so suddenly, but Mr. Blythe was a man of many interests. I'm sure there are many who are more affected by this than I. Poirot nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. You speak of his interests, madam. What sort of interests might those be? Mrs. Forsyth's gaze didn't waver. Mr. Blythe was a businessman, as are many of us here. Some of his dealings were perhaps less conventional than others, but I think we all have our secrets, don't we, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot studied her carefully. There was something in her tone, a sharpness, a calculated nature that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. But for now, Poirot had only just begun to probe. The questions continued. each person's answers contributing more to the growing sense of mystery. Each word spoken, each silence held, added another layer to the puzzle. Poirot's mind worked tirelessly, sorting through the contradictions and half-truths. But what was most striking was the palpable shift in the guests' demeanor. The easy, light atmosphere of the gala had transformed into something darker, and Poirot could sense that all of them, without exception, had something to hide. As the questioning drew to a close, Poirot paused, his mind racing through the details. One thing was clear: the truth was buried beneath layers of deception, and only Poirot's little gray cells could uncover it. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives there in the Grand Hotel de la Ville had shifted from festive to heavy with suspicion. Guests who had once whispered in delight now spoke in hushed, uncertain tones. The opulent ballroom, which only moments ago had been filled with laughter and the clink of champagne glasses, now felt stifled, as if the walls themselves were closing in on those who remained. Hercule Poirot entered the room with his customary calm precision. His gaze swept over the gathering, taking in every face, every gesture, every subtle movement. His mind was already working, already cataloging the details that others had missed. This was no ordinary crime. This was something far more complex. The constable, a stout man whose unease was palpable, stepped forward to greet him. "Monsieur Poirot, we've gathered everyone who was in the hotel when the crime occurred. They're all here, waiting for you." Poirot nodded silently and turned his attention to the room. 12 people, all in varying degrees of discomfort, stood clustered together in the middle of the ballroom. It was as if they had been frozen by the weight of the situation, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. Their faces were masks of nervousness, but Poirot knew better than to take them at face value. He approached the group slowly, his eyes scanning each individual with practiced precision. The first to catch his eye was the hotel manager, Mr. Alfonso Montelli, a tall, thin man with a perpetually furrowed brow. Montelli's usually composed appearance was now marred by visible distress. His eyes darted between the other suspects, his posture stiff as though he were trying to maintain some semblance of control in a situation that was clearly slipping beyond his reach. Poirot's gaze shifted to Mrs. Beatrice Forsyth, an older woman with silver hair and a regal air. She stood slightly apart from the others, her expression cool and composed, but her tight grip on her handbag suggested she was not as unperturbed as she appeared. Poirot had already noted her earlier remark about Blythe's death being inevitable, and he suspected there was far more behind that statement than a simple reflection on life's fragility. Richard Devereux, a stocky man in his 40s with a thick accent, shifted uncomfortably under Poirot's gaze. Devereux had been seen with Blythe earlier that evening, and the two had shared a private conversation at the bar. It was unclear what their relationship had been, but Poirot could sense the tension between them, a hidden animosity that lingered beneath the surface. Clara Vandenberg, a woman with delicate features and an air of aloofness, stood next to Devereux, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She avoided Poirot's gaze, her eyes flickering nervously as though she were trying to distance herself from the scrutiny. Clara had been one of the last to see Blythe alive, but her reluctance to speak spoke volumes to Poirot. The others, too, were under his watchful eye. Each of them carried a story, a secret, a motive that Poirot was determined to uncover. But for now, he remained silent, allowing the tension in the room to build. He could see that they were all waiting for him to make the first move. Poirot took a step forward and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, I trust you are all aware of the gravity of the situation. A man has been murdered, and the question that remains is not how, but why. Why did someone choose to end the life of Henry Blythe?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I shall not waste time with pleasantries. I will ask you to speak honestly, But know this: each one of you is under suspicion. Each one of you has a motive, and it is my task to uncover the truth." The guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Poirot and each other. He could sense their discomfort, their fear, but he was not moved by it. The game had already begun, and Poirot was the one holding all the cards. He turned first to Montelli, the hotel manager, who had been visibly shaken ever since the discovery of the body. "Monsieur Montelli," Poirot began, his voice soft but firm, "you were the first to find Mr. Blythe. Tell me, what did you see when you entered the room?" Montelli cleared his throat, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. I entered the library when I heard the scream. Mr. Blythe was already on the floor, dead. There was nothing unusual about this scene, except for the position of his body. It was almost as if he had collapsed near the globe on purpose. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, glancing toward the antique globe in the corner of the room. Yes, the globe," he mused, his voice low. "It is curious, is it not? Why would Mr. Blythe be found so close to it? Was it simply coincidence, or something more?" Montelli shifted uncomfortably, but before he could respond, Poirot turned his attention to the others. "Madame Forsyth," Poirot said, his eyes locking onto the older woman, "I understand you have known Mr. Blythe for quite some time. Did he have any enemies, perhaps? Any rivals?" Mrs. Forsyth gave a tight smile, but Poirot saw the brief flicker of tension in her eyes. "Mr. Blythe was a man of many interests," she replied evenly. "I cannot say he had any enemies, but I suppose there are those who would have preferred him out of the picture. And what about you, Monsieur Devereux?" Poirot asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned toward the stocky man. "You had a business connection with Mr. Blythe, yes? Was there any trouble between you?" Devereux opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it, his brow furrowing. "I know, nothing that could have led to this. It was just business, Poirot. Nothing more." Poirot studied Devereux for a long moment before turning away. He had learned little more than he had already suspected, but each answer was another piece of the puzzle. He gave the group one last look. "Do not think I have forgotten anyone here. Each one of you has a role to play in this mystery, and I will find it. The truth, as always, is hidden in the smallest of details." The room fell into silence once more as Poirot stepped back. His work had only just begun. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The ballroom was still, the only sounds coming from the occasional shuffle of feet or the soft rustle of a dress. The tension in the room was almost tangible, like a living entity that pressed in on the guests. Poirot, standing at the center, had already made his observations. Each suspect had something to hide, and his task was to reveal the truths they had carefully buried beneath layers of deception. "Mon ami," Poirot said to the constable, his voice cutting through the silence, "it is time for the first of many interviews. We must uncover what lies beneath the surface." The constable nodded nervously, making a half-hearted attempt to straighten his uniform. Poirot gave him a reassuring smile before turning toward the group of suspects. He could sense the weight of their unease, the way they shifted their weight from one foot to the other. But no one spoke, not yet. Poirot wasted no time. He turned to Mrs. Forsyth, who stood at the edge of the group, her hands tightly clasped in front of her. "Madame Forsyth, you knew Mr. Blythe for some time, did you not? Tell me about your acquaintance with him." Mrs. Forsyth stiffened at the directness of Poirot's question, her lips curving into a thin, controlled smile. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. I knew him quite well. He was a frequent guest here at the hotel. We had many conversations, though I must admit, they were always brief. Mr. Blythe was a man of many interests, most of which he kept to himself." Poirot nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, of course. But surely there was more to your relationship. Was he involved in any business ventures that might have caused friction with others?" Mrs. Forsyth's eyes flickered briefly, but she quickly regained her composure. Mr. Blythe had dealings in the financial world, but I am not privy to the specifics. I can't imagine that anything in his business affairs would have led to such a tragedy. Poirot was unconvinced. There was a hesitation in her voice, a subtle shift that suggested she knew more than she was willing to admit. But for now, he let the matter lie. Moving on to the next, he turned to Richard Devereux, the stocky businessman with the heavy accent. Devereux was standing with his arms crossed, his gaze shifting from the floor to Poirot's intense stare. "Monsieur Devereux," Poirot began, "you mentioned earlier that you had business dealings with Mr. Blythe. Can you tell me more about that? Were there any disagreements between you two?" Devereux cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the side before returning to Poirot. "We had our differences, like any two businessmen, but nothing that would warrant, well, this." He gestured vaguely toward the body. "It was always professional. I can't imagine why anyone would want to harm him." Poirot's sharp eyes never left Devereux's face. "Ah, but you see, Monsieur Devereux, sometimes the most dangerous disagreements are those that remain unspoken, are they not? Tell me, did Mr. Blythe ever mention anyone who might have a reason to harm him?" Devereux hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "No, not that I can recall." Poirot nodded, but his mind was already working. There was something off about Devereux's answers, something that didn't quite add up. But for now, he would let it go. He moved on to the next person in the line, Clara Vandenberg. Clara was standing stiffly, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. Her eyes avoided Poirot's, instead focusing on the floor. Poirot noted her discomfort and took a step closer. "Madame Vandenberg," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "I understand that you spoke with Mr. Blythe earlier this evening. What did you discuss?" Clara's gaze snapped up to meet Poirot's, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. We didn't discuss much," she said quickly, her voice rising slightly in pitch. "It was just small talk. He asked me about the music. Nothing more." Poirot tilted his head, studying her carefully. "Small talk, you say, but I have observed that you are avoiding my gaze. That suggests something else. You are nervous, Madame Vandenberg." "Why?" Clara's face flushed, and she took a step back. "I'm not nervous. I don't know what to say." Poirot took a step forward, his gaze softening but still intense. "Madam, I do not require the full details of your conversation, but I do need the truth. Was there anything unusual in your exchange with Mr. Blythe? Did he seem concerned, agitated?" Clara hesitated again, but this time, her eyes flicked toward the door, as though contemplating an escape. "No," she said, her voice quieter now. "He was calm, very calm, nothing out of the ordinary." Poirot's mind processed her words carefully. He could tell she was hiding something, but he would need more time to coax it out of her. "Thank you, madam," Poirot said, his tone even, but his eyes never leaving hers. "For now, that will be all." He turned to the rest of the group, his gaze sweeping across the room once more. "There are many contradictions in your stories, my friends. You all tell me different things, but none of you tell me the truth. Not yet." The guests shifted, uncomfortably, but Poirot's words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. The investigation was only beginning, but Poirot knew that the web of deception was already beginning to unravel. As he took a step back, he allowed the room to fall into silence once again. He had gathered the first pieces, but there was still much more to learn. Chapter 6. First false-led soft murmur of conversation continued in the grand ballroom, but Hercule Poirot stood apart from the group, his gaze fixed on the faces of the suspects as he carefully weighed their words. He had listened, observed, and noted every shift in posture, every subtle glance exchanged between the suspects. Yet there was something still missing. The key to this puzzle had not yet been revealed. But Poirot's mind was already sifting through the lies, the half-truths, and the contradictions. After a long silence, Poirot finally broke the stillness. "It is becoming clear that none of you have told me the complete truth," he said softly, but with the kind of authority that immediately commanded attention. "You all have motives. There are hidden things behind your words, things you would rather keep hidden." The constable, standing to the side, fidgeted nervously. "Monsieur Poirot, I think we've found something that might help," he stammered, clearly uncertain whether to speak. Poirot's eyes glinted. "Go on," he urged. The constable handed Poirot a small piece of paper, folded neatly in half. Poirot opened it, reading quickly. The paper was an official-looking document, a letter, with a name and an address scrawled hastily across the top. It was an invoice, listing an expensive set of rare artifacts recently purchased by someone from the hotel's accounts. Poirot raised an eyebrow, glancing up at the constable. "This is interesting," he murmured, as his fingers traced the letter's contents. The invoice had a date that matched the time of Mr. Blythe's visit, but what caught Poirot's attention was the name of the buyer, Richard Devereux. Poirot's gaze shifted to Devereux, who was standing in the corner of the room, seemingly unaware of the implications of the letter now in Poirot's hands. His face was unreadable, but Poirot had already noticed the briefest flash of unease in the man's eyes when the document was presented. "Ah, Monsieur Devereux," Poirot said smoothly, his voice quiet but filled with intent. "It seems you have made an interesting purchase." Devereux's eyes narrowed, but he quickly recovered his composure. I don't see how that is relevant to the murder of Mr. Blythe," he replied, his voice thick with the faintest edge of irritation. Poirot tilted his head slightly, a knowing look crossing his face. "No, of course, but you see, Monsieur Devereux, this invoice shows that you recently acquired something very valuable, something that was to be kept a secret, a set of rare antiques, some of which were said to be worth quite a fortune." Devereux shifted uneasily, but his voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're implying." Poirot: "Yes, I purchased those artifacts for an investment, but I certainly had no reason to harm Blythe. We had a professional relationship, nothing more." Poirot regarded him for a moment before speaking again, his tone growing more deliberate. "And yet, Monsieur Devereux, you did not tell us about this transaction. Why keep it a secret? What connection did Mr. Blythe have with your business dealings? Was there something about the artifacts that might have caused trouble between you?" Devereux seemed to stiffen at the accusation, but he quickly regained his composure. "There was no trouble between us," he insisted, his voice strained. "I simply didn't see the need to mention it. The purchase was private, a personal investment." Poirot did not seem convinced. His eyes narrowed as he studied Devereux for a moment longer before he spoke. But you see, Monsieur Devereux, this does not add up. The documents show that you were involved in a very lucrative but highly secretive transaction. What if Blythe discovered something about your dealings? What if he threatened to expose you?" Devereux opened his mouth to speak, but then paused as if calculating the best response. His jaw tightened before he spoke. "You're grasping at straws, Poirot. There's no connection between that purchase and his death." Poirot held his gaze, but his mind was already turning. This new lead was intriguing, but it felt too convenient, too simple. Poirot had learned long ago that things were rarely as they appeared. The document was compelling, but it was also too easy a lead, one that might just be planted to throw him off course. Poirot let out a soft sigh. "Monsieur Devereux, I am not suggesting you are guilty, but we cannot ignore this lead. However, I must also remind you that many of your statements seem to neatly timed to convenient. You may wish to reconsider how you present your answers." Devereux's expression hardened, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on Poirot. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as everyone seemed to await Poirot's next move. But Poirot, ever patient, allowed the silence to stretch. He could see Devereux's nervousness now, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Poirot turned his attention back to the rest of the group. "This," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of finality, "is merely a first step. I believe this invoice is only a piece of the larger puzzle, but I suspect it was placed here deliberately. The question is why." The constable, still processing the information, stepped forward cautiously. "So, you don't think Devereux is guilty?" Poirot shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Devereux's face. "Not yet. But one thing is certain. Someone wanted to mislead us, to plant a false lead. And I suspect it was done to divert our attention away from something else. Someone who thinks they can outsmart me." He turned back to the suspects, his gaze steady. "I will find the truth, but not by following easy answers. I will uncover what lies hidden, step by step, and I will not be misled." The room fell silent again as Poirot's words echoed in the still air. It was clear to everyone now, the game had only just begun. Chapter 7. The psychological gamut of tension in the room was palpable. Poirot had made it clear that he was not satisfied with the answers he had received so far. His sharp mind had already begun to piece together the disjointed fragments of the case. But there were still so many unanswered questions. As the suspects shifted uncomfortably, Poirot knew that it was time to put his skills to work, not just to ask questions, but to provoke. The subtle psychological game had begun. He moved toward the group, his hands clasped behind his back. "It seems we have reached a point where the truth is not so simple. There are contradictions, lies, and a web of half-truths woven throughout your stories." Poirot's gaze flicked briefly to each individual before he continued, "But I will not be misled. I will find the key that unlocks this mystery." The suspects exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort growing by the second. Poirot's reputation preceded him, and each one of them knew what it meant to be under his scrutiny. They could no longer hide behind their facades of charm or propriety. Poirot's first target was Mrs. Forsyth. She had remained calm throughout the questioning, but Poirot could see the subtle cracks in her composure. Her eyes, which had once been so controlled, now betrayed the slightest flicker of anxiety. "Madame Forsyth," Poirot began softly, "you have been remarkably composed." "Too composed, perhaps, but I must ask, what is it that you are hiding?" Mrs. Forsyth stiffened, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Monsieur Poirot, I have nothing to hide. I simply believe that the situation will be resolved with time, as it always is." Poirot leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "Ah, but that is the problem, madam. You see, in my experience, it is those who speak the least, those who avoid the details, who have the most to conceal." Mrs. Forsyth's eyes narrowed, but she remained silent. Poirot let the silence stretch, his eyes never leaving hers. He could feel the walls she had built around herself slowly beginning to crack. She was hiding something, he was certain of it. "Tell me, madam," Poirot continued, his voice like velvet, "have you ever had a disagreement with Mr. Blythe? Perhaps over a matter of money or business, or even something more personal?" Mrs. Forsyth's jaw tightened, but her eyes betrayed her. "I told you already, Monsieur Poirot," she said coldly. "I had no reason to harm him. None at all." Poirot stepped back, his expression unreadable. He could tell she was lying, but he would need more than just her words. He would need to see her cracks deepen, to expose her vulnerabilities. For now, he let her be, turning his attention to Richard Devereux, who had been silent for some time. Devereux had been quick to defend himself earlier, but now he stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his body language defensive. Poirot studied him carefully, noting the tension in his posture. "Monsieur Devereux," Poirot said, his voice measured but firm, I find it interesting that you were so quick to present your innocence. Yet, you were the first to have the most to gain from Mr. Blythe's death, were you not? Business interests, investments, perhaps something you were not willing to share. Devereux shifted, his eyes flashing with irritation. I've already told you, he said, his voice rising. Blythe and I were business partners, yes, but nothing more. The idea that I would kill him over a business deal is absurd. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Perhaps, but you see, Monsieur Devereux, it is the very absurdity that makes it so believable. The best lies are always the ones closest to the truth, n'est-ce pas? Devereux's face reddened, and for a brief moment, Poirot saw something flicker in his eyes, fear, or perhaps guilt. But Devereux quickly regained his composure, his voice steady once more. I am not afraid of your insinuations, Poirot. I did not kill him. Poirot studied him for a moment longer, his mind churning through the possibilities. Devereux was hiding something, whether it was guilt or knowledge of someone else's guilt. Poirot couldn't say, but he knew there was more to the man than met the eye next. Poirot turned his attention to Clara Vandenberg, who had been notably quiet since her initial questioning. She stood near the back of the room, her arms tightly crossed, her eyes scanning the floor. The nervous fidgeting, the subtle shifting of her weight, it all pointed to one thing: she was terrified. Madame Vandenberg, Poirot said, his voice quiet but sharp, you have remained silent throughout much of this. Tell me, why is that? Are you perhaps afraid of revealing the truth? Clara flinched slightly, her gaze snapping up to meet him. For a moment, Poirot saw something in her eyes, a flicker of panic, but she quickly masked it with an indifferent expression. I have nothing to add, she said stiffly. I barely knew Mr. Blythe. Poirot stepped closer to her, his presence almost overwhelming. Ah, but that is the problem, madam. You did know him, and you are hiding something. I know it, and you know it. Clara's breath caught in her throat, but she said nothing. The silence hung in the air like a weight, and Poirot could see the walls around her beginning to crumble. He had found her weakness, her fear. Poirot smiled to himself, but it was a small, almost imperceptible smile. He knew exactly what he was doing. The psychological game was in full swing, and he was watching as the cracks in each suspect's facade grew wider. The truth was coming, slowly but surely, and when it arrived, it would be more devastating than any of them could have anticipated. Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. Tension in the room had reached its peak. Poirot had methodically questioned each of the suspects, peeling back the layers of their stories, each answer revealing more contradictions, more subtle signs of deception. But even as the walls began to close in on the guilty party, something shifted in the atmosphere. Something that Poirot could not ignore. The door to the ballroom creaked open, and the constable entered, his face pale and strained. Poirot's sharp gaze immediately fixed on him. The constable seemed to hesitate for a moment, unsure of how to deliver the news. But Poirot had learned long ago that hesitation was often a sign of something crucial being held back. What is it, mon ami? Poirot asked, his voice low but insistent. The constable cleared his throat and stepped forward. Monsieur Poirot, there has been another incident. We found something. Poirot's brow furrowed. What do you mean, something? Has another crime occurred? The constable nodded, his voice trembling. A woman, Miss Vanessa Collins, was found in the hallway near the hotel's library. She had collapsed. We're not sure, but it seems as though someone may have tried to poison her. Poirot's eyes immediately sharpened. This was unexpected, and yet, somehow, it made perfect sense. The connections were becoming clearer. This wasn't just about a single murder. Someone was actively trying to cover their tracks. A poisoning, you say? Poirot repeated, his mind already racing. He turned to the group of suspects, his gaze intense. Which of you was the last to see Miss Collins? Who had access to her before this? Attempt. The guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he took in the room. The guilty party was not one to back down so easily. The silence was telling. It was as though someone in the room was quietly calculating their next move. Hoping to avoid suspicion, Poirot turned back to the constable. "Is Miss Collins all right? Is she still conscious?" The constable shook his head. "She's stable, but she hasn't said much. The doctor is with her now, but she seems to have suffered from something similar to a slow-acting poison." Poirot's mind worked furiously as he absorbed the new information. Poison. This was no longer just a murder mystery. It had turned into a series of calculated attempts, each move more deliberate than the last. Someone was trying to ensure that their crime would remain buried, and Poirot could feel the delicate web of deceit tightening around him. "Did anyone hear or see anything unusual?" Poirot asked the group, his voice calm but commanding. His eyes flit to each suspect, studying their reactions, that no one responded immediately. Poirot could see that they were all trying to maintain control, trying to keep their faces neutral. But he wasn't fooled. There was more going on here than just one death. Now, with a second crime emerging, the stakes had been raised, and the game had become even more dangerous. Poirot took a step back, his hands clasped behind his back. "It seems, my friends, that this is no longer simply about one man's death. We have now entered into a far more complicated situation. Someone among us is not only a murderer, but a manipulator, a person who wants to ensure that their actions go unnoticed, that their dark deeds remain in the shadows." The room was thick with tension. The guests exchanged uncertain glances, their faces pale under the harsh light of Poirot's scrutiny. Each of them was now a potential accomplice or a victim. Poirot's eyes softened, and for a moment, his tone took on a quieter edge. "Do not mistake me. I am not suggesting that all of you are involved, but this is no longer a simple case of murder. There is a game being played, and the rules are shifting with each passing moment." He turned toward the constable. "Have you secured the scene of the poisoning? Any potential evidence that might give us a clue as to how Miss Collins was poisoned?" The constable nodded. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. We've taken the glass she was drinking from and a small vial that seemed to contain the substance. We're having it analyzed now." Poirot nodded in approval. "Good. Keep me informed. But for now, I must ask you all to consider this: who stands to gain from Miss Collins's death? Who benefits from her silence? Who among you knew that she might be an obstacle?" There was a long pause as Poirot's words hung in the air. The group remained silent, but Poirot could feel the pressure mounting. He had thrown down the gauntlet, and now it was time for them to show their true faces. Poirot's gaze swept the room once more, lingering on the suspects. Each of them was now implicated in a far more dangerous plot than he had first realized. The stakes were higher, the game more intricate. Someone was playing a game of shadows, and Poirot was determined to uncover every hidden move. He allowed the room to remain silent for a moment longer, knowing that the next few moments would reveal more than any questioning could. The guilt, the fear, the secrets, everything would come to the surface, and Poirot would be there, watching, waiting, ready to see through the lies. As he turned to face the constable, Poirot knew that this investigation had taken a decisive turn. It was no longer about finding one killer. It was about exposing a deeper conspiracy, one that had begun long before the first murder. The game was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The silence in the ballroom was almost deafening, the weight of Poirot's words hanging heavily in the air. The discovery of Miss Collins' poisoning had shifted the case into uncharted territory, and everyone knew it. The tension was palpable as the suspects exchanged uneasy glances, all too aware that Poirot's focus had shifted sharply onto them. No one could hide behind their polite facades any longer. Poirot's sharp eyes swept across the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the darting glances, the quick, nervous movements. He could feel the walls of deceit closing in, but he was patient. The game was afoot, and he had no intention of rushing toward the final move. Not yet. He stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression calm but calculating. "I see," he began softly, his voice carrying through the stillness. "It seems there are many layers to this puzzle, layers that are not so easily uncovered." The guests were silent, waiting for him to continue. Poirot's gaze moved from one person to the next, lingering on each of them, taking in their every reaction. He could feel their fear, but also something more, a growing sense of frustration. It was clear they were no longer in control of the narrative. Poirot had taken the reins. "Monsieur Devereux," Poirot said, his voice turning sharp as he fixed his gaze on the stocky businessman. "You were quick to distance yourself from Mr. Blythe's murder, but I have been thinking about your relationship with Miss Collins." Devereux shifted, his face tightening slightly. He was trying to mask his discomfort, but Poirot could see through it. "Miss Collins? What do you mean?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You see, Monsieur Devereux, your business dealings were mentioned earlier, but now it seems there may be another connection. Miss Collins was not just a guest here, not just an innocent bystander. She had ties to people in this hotel. To you, perhaps." Devereux's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, Poirot caught the hint of something darker beneath the surface. "I've already told you," Devereux snapped, his voice growing louder. "I had no quarrel with her. She had her own life, and I had mine. We were acquaintances, nothing more." Poirot did not react to the outburst. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "But that is the problem, Monsieur Devereux. You see, people who claim to be just acquaintances often know far more than they let on. And the fact that you deny even the most innocent of associations only raises suspicion." Devereux clenched his fists, but he did not speak again. Poirot moved on, his eyes flicking to Mrs. Forsyth. "And you, Madame Forsyth, I wonder if you also knew Miss Collins better than you let on." Mrs. Forsyth's sharp eyes met Poirot's, her lips curving into a small, polite smile. "I knew Miss Collins, of course," she replied smoothly. "She was a guest here, just as I am. We had several conversations, but nothing of consequence. What would you have me say?" Poirot's voice remained measured, but his gaze was unwavering. "I suspect you knew more than that. You have a sharp mind, madam, and I believe you recognized Miss Collins' role in something far more complex. Perhaps you even knew about her connections to other people in this hotel, connections that could have been dangerous." Mrs. Forsyth's smile faltered ever so slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "You are mistaken, Monsieur Poirot. You are making wild assumptions." Poirot took a step back, his eyes flicking toward the others in the room. "I see, but let us not focus solely on the business of Mr. Blythe or Miss Collins for now. There are deeper connections at play, are there not?" He turned toward Clara Vandenberg, who had been watching the exchange from a distance. "Madame Vandenberg," he said, his tone quiet but firm, "I suspect that you have more to reveal. You have been quiet throughout much of this investigation, but you were also one of the last people seen speaking with Mr. Blythe." Clara stiffened, her hands tightening around her dress. "I've told you all I know," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I barely spoke to him. It was nothing." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his gaze intense. "Ah, but you see, Madame Vandenberg, people who are not involved in a crime do not act nervous. They do not fidget or avoid eye contact. You, on the other hand, have done both. Why?" Clara's face paled, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Poirot's gaze flicked briefly to the others. "There is something more to this, something hidden behind your words." Perhaps your silence is not so innocent after all." The room remained still, but the tension was thick enough to suffocate anyone who wasn't focused on the task at hand. Poirot had uncovered cracks in their stories, but the full picture was still out of reach. The web of deception was growing, and he could feel himself drawing closer to the center of it. Poirot straightened, his posture relaxed, but his mind sharp. "What we have here are not just mere coincidences, my friends. No, these are patterns, connections waiting to be uncovered. Each of you is tied to something far larger than you understand, and I will uncover it." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You see, the key to this puzzle is not just in the details of the murder itself. It is in the relationships, the hidden motives, the connections that have been carefully concealed." Poirot turned to the constable, who had been quietly observing the interactions. "Mon ami, continue your investigation into Miss Collins' poisoning. It may reveal something we have missed." The constable nodded, but as he turned to leave, Poirot stopped him with a soft word. "And remember, no one leaves this hotel until I have all the answers." With that, Poirot turned back to the suspects, his eyes gleaming with a quiet confidence. The game was far from over, and he was only just beginning to pull the threads together. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue room was quieter now, each guest lost in their own thoughts, their faces clouded with confusion and suspicion. Poirot had put his pieces on the board, but the puzzle remained unsolved. His questions had unearthed far more than he had anticipated. Yet the true nature of the crime, the thread that bound the events together, still eluded him. Poirot stood near the center of the room, his eyes carefully scanning the gathered suspects. His mind was working furiously, parsing through each word, each gesture, each subtle inconsistency. The answers were there, buried beneath layers of deception. He had always believed that human behavior was the key to unraveling the truth, and now, as always, he relied on his little gray cells to see what others could not. He turned to the constable, who had been standing by the door, awaiting his next instructions. "Monsieur, I require one more look at the scene of Mr. Blythe's death. I believe there is something we have overlooked." The constable, eager to please, nodded. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot, but I must warn you, the scene has already been examined." Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. "Ah, but the truth is rarely so simple. Sometimes, monsieur, one must look again closer, for it is only then that the smallest of clues, the most insignificant of details, reveals itself." The constable led Poirot back to the library, where Blythe's body had been discovered. The room still smelled faintly of the old wood and the lingering scent of spilled wine. The antique globe, now motionless, sat in its corner, seemingly innocent. Poirot stepped forward, his fingers brushing lightly over its surface. There was nothing about it that seemed particularly unusual, but Poirot's mind was already racing. He glanced toward the body, his sharp gaze taking in every detail. Blythe had been a man of some importance, but now, lying lifeless, he had become a puzzle. Poirot studied the positioning of the body again, noticing something he had missed earlier, a slight mark on the floor beside Blythe's right hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Mon ami," Poirot said to the constable, who stood at the door. "I believe there is something beneath this globe. Please help me move it." The constable stepped forward and assisted Poirot, and together they shifted the heavy object. As it rolled aside, the floor beneath it revealed a small compartment, nearly invisible to anyone who might have passed by without examining it closely. Poirot's hand hovered over the compartment, his fingers hovering just above the edge, but he paused before touching it. "There it is," Poirot murmured to himself. The constable, eager to see what had been uncovered, leaned forward. "What is it, Poirot?" Poirot's eyes gleamed as he slowly lifted the edge of the compartment, revealing a small, carefully folded letter. His fingers were delicate as he unfolded it, his expression unreadable. The paper was thin, old, and worn at the edges, but the ink was still clear. It was a note, short, simple, but revealing. Poirot read aloud, his voice soft, almost to himself. "It is time to settle the score. No more hiding. The end is near." The words sent a ripple through the room. The constable's face twisted in confusion, but Poirot's mind was already turning. This note was a direct message. It had been left for someone. But for whom? The language, Poirot continued thoughtfully, is deliberate. This is no ordinary letter. Whoever wrote this wanted it to be found. He looked at the constable, his expression a mixture of curiosity and certainty. This note was placed here to point us toward something, or someone. It is a clue, but not one that gives us the full picture. Poirot turned toward the group of suspects, all of whom had been waiting for his next move. "There are many threads to follow, my friends," Poirot said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "But this letter is a key. Someone here knew of Blythe's plans, and someone here wanted him silenced." The room fell into a hushed silence as everyone absorbed the weight of Poirot's words. Each person was now suspect, their motives unclear, their connections to Blythe and each other tangled. Yet Poirot was certain that one of them had left the note, and the others, whether they realized it or not, were part of a game that had already been set into motion. Poirot turned his attention back to the letter. This message is not just about Mr. Blythe's death. It speaks of something far greater, something that connects each of you. The question is, who is the sender? Who wanted this message to be found? His gaze flicked over each person in the room, pausing on their faces. The truth is hidden behind the lies. The connections you all share are the key to unlocking it. The constable stood in the background, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, clearly eager to hear Poirot's next steps. "Monsieur Poirot, what do we do now?" Poirot's eyes flashed with quiet determination. "Now, we dig deeper. We expose the truth behind this letter. The sender is someone in this room, and once we uncover their identity, the mystery will begin to unravel." Poirot stepped back from the globe, his hands clasped behind his back. "I will take no more false leads. From now on, we follow only the truth." The room was thick with anticipation. Poirot knew the final reveal was near, but the game had one more twist to play. Chapter 11. Tension's recent discovery of the letter had shifted the entire focus of the investigation. Poirot's sharp mind churned over the cryptic message, each word carefully considered, each syllable weighed for its meaning. His earlier confidence had not wavered, but now, more than ever, the stakes had grown higher. The game, it seemed, was no longer one of simple logic. It was a test of patience, of understanding human nature, of recognizing the lies that others believed to be truths. The guests stood in a semicircle around him, their faces a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Poirot could feel their unease, each person now on edge, unsure of what would come next. He had shifted the game, forcing them all into a position where they could no longer pretend to be unaware. Poirot took a step back, glancing at the assembled suspects. "I have revealed a piece of the puzzle," he said softly, his gaze sweeping over them. "But there is more to this mystery than meets the eye, and it is not just Mr. Blythe's death that we must uncover. No, it is the reason why someone wanted him dead and who stood to gain from his silence." He allowed the silence to linger, watching as the guests exchanged uneasy glances. There was a palpable shift in the room. For the first time, they seemed to understand that the investigation was no longer about a single murder. It was about something larger, something far more dangerous. Poirot turned to face the constable. "Mon ami, I want you to gather all of the guests together in the drawing room. I must speak to each of them, one by one. The time for subtlety is over." The constable nodded quickly, eager to act on Poirot's orders. As he moved to carry them out, Poirot's eyes returned to the group. He knew that the tension between the suspects had reached a breaking point. They were not all innocent, but who among them was guilty? That was the question that now burned in his mind. Moments later, the group was assembled in the drawing room, the atmosphere heavier than ever. Poirot stood at the center, his posture relaxed, but his mind racing. He had no intention of letting anyone leave this room until the truth had been revealed. His gaze moved over the group, lingering briefly on each suspect before he spoke. Monsieur Devereux. Poirot began, his voice cutting through the silence. You were the first to speak of business dealings with Mr. Blythe. But tell me, what business was it? Exactly, what was it that made your relationship with him so contentious? Devereux shifted in his seat, his face stiffening. I've told you before, Poirot. We had a few business dealings, nothing more. Some investments, nothing out of the ordinary. Poirot studied him, his eyes narrowing. Ah, but you see, monsieur, it is the ordinary things that often mask the extraordinary. The investments, what were they exactly? Were they connected to something larger, something more dangerous? Devereux's jaw tightened, but he refused to answer directly. I told you, he repeated, his voice rising slightly. There's nothing to it. You're grasping at straws. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Devereux's face. Perhaps, but I believe you are not telling me everything. He moved on, his gaze shifting to Mrs. Forsyth, whose cool composure had begun to slip ever so slightly. Madame Forsyth, Poirot said, his voice soft, you were the last to speak with Mr. Blythe before his death. What was the nature of your conversation? Mrs. Forsyth's eyes flickered with the briefest hint of surprise, but she quickly masked it. We spoke briefly, Monsieur Poirot. He was here for a few days, and we exchanged pleasantries. Nothing more. Poirot stepped closer, his voice quiet but insistent. But that is not what I have heard, madam. Others have told me that you and Mr. Blythe shared more than just pleasantries, that you knew something about him, something he did not want others to know. Is that true? Mrs. Forsyth stiffened, but she quickly regained her composure. I don't know what you're implying, Monsieur Poirot. I have nothing to hide. Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes never leaving hers. Ah, madam, I am not implying anything. I am simply asking for the truth, the whole truth, and I believe you know it. He turned his attention next to Clara Vandenberg, whose eyes were now firmly fixed on the floor. Madame Vandenberg, Poirot began, I must ask you again, what did you discuss with Mr. Blythe before his death? You have been very quiet during this investigation. Too quiet. Clara flinched, but she quickly composed herself. I've told you already. I barely knew him. We spoke about the music and some trivial things. There's nothing more to say. Poirot's gaze softened, but there was still an edge of determination in his voice. Madame Vandenberg, I believe you are hiding something. Your discomfort, your nervousness, it speaks volumes. Why are you so afraid to tell me the truth? Clara remained silent, her fingers trembling slightly as they twisted the fabric of her dress. Poirot's eyes flickered over her face, but he did not press her further yet. He would let her reveal her secrets in time. Finally, Poirot turned to the remaining guests, his eyes scanning each face carefully. I see now, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else, that you are all connected by something far greater than you realize. But one of you holds the key, the one who knows how to play the game, how to manipulate the rest of you. The group sat in uneasy silence, each person now fully aware of Poirot's suspicions. The tension between them was palpable, and it was clear that they were no longer just suspects in a murder investigation. They were players in a game, and Poirot had already begun to move the pieces. With a final glance at the group, Poirot said, the truth will be revealed soon, and when it is, you will all understand that no secret can remain hidden forever. Chapter 12. The confrontation. The evening had grown darker, the once glittering ballroom now shrouded in an eerie silence. that seemed to weigh on everyone present. The investigation had reached a turning point, and Hercule Poirot could feel the weight of each second as it passed. He had cornered his suspects, each of them showing more signs of unease as the pressure mounted. But Poirot knew that the answers were close. The final pieces of the puzzle were within his grasp. It was only a matter of time before someone would make the mistake of revealing too much. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him. His gaze swept over the group of suspects, each of them now visibly uncomfortable under his scrutiny. The full weight of composure that they had maintained throughout the investigation was beginning to crack. They could feel the walls closing in. "Madame Forsyth," Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding, "you have been particularly guarded in your answers. I wonder if you have been hiding something from us." Mrs. Forsyth stiffened at the mention of her name, but her expression remained unchanged. "I've told you everything I know, Monsieur Poirot," she replied coolly. "There's nothing more to say." Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed. "Ah, but you see, madam, that is where you are mistaken. I believe you know more than you have admitted. Your calm demeanor, your control, it is to perfect. You see, people who hide the truth often believe they can fool others with a mask of composure. But I have studied you, madam, and I see the cracks in your forehead." Mrs. Forsyth's lips tightened, but she did not respond. Poirot's gaze shifted to the others, noting their reactions. Devereux had shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between Mrs. Forsyth and Poirot, clearly uncomfortable. Clara Vandenberg, on the other hand, was sitting with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. Poirot turned his attention to Devereux, who had been noticeably on edge since the investigation began. "Monsieur Devereux," Poirot said, his voice steady, "you two have been less forthcoming with your answers. You claim to have had no significant relationship with Mr. Blythe, but I wonder if that is the truth." Devereux's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained calm. "I have told you everything I know about Blythe. We had business dealings, yes, but there was no reason for me to harm him." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Devereux's face. "And yet, monsieur, you were the first to benefit from Mr. Blythe's death. A mysterious letter was found that linked you to a transaction involving rare artifacts, a transaction that you failed to mention. Why is that, Monsieur Devereux? Why the secrecy?" Devereux's face flushed, but he remained silent, clearly weighing his options. Poirot could see the conflict in his eyes. He was trying to maintain control, to hold onto the last shred of his composure, but the pressure was building, and Poirot knew it wouldn't be long before Devereux made a mistake. Poirot straightened up and turned to Clara Vandenberg. "Madame Vandenberg," he said softly, "you have been silent for much of this investigation, but your silence speaks volumes. What are you hiding?" Clara's gaze flickered to Poirot's, but she quickly looked away. "I've already told you everything," she said in a low voice. "I don't know anything more." Poirot took a step closer to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You see, Madame Vandenberg, people who remain silent do so for a reason. You have not told me the full truth. There is something in your past that you are trying to bury, and I believe it is connected to Mr. Blythe's death." Clara stiffened, her hands tightening around the fabric of her dress. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice trembling. Poirot's eyes softened, but his expression remained firm. "Madame Vandenberg, you may not want to admit it, but I know that you are hiding something. Perhaps it is time for you to stop running from the truth." The room was thick with tension. The guests were all watching now, each of them anxiously waiting for Poirot to make his next move. But Poirot remained calm, his mind already working through the final pieces of the puzzle. He could see the fear in their eyes, but he knew that fear would lead them to make mistakes. It always did. Poirot stepped back, allowing the silence to stretch between them. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he did not let it rattle him. He had no intention of revealing everything just yet. No, the game was far from over. In fact, he was just getting started. The truth, Poirot said, his voice low but certain, is closer than you think. One of you is lying, and that lie is the key to this entire mystery. But I will not force you to speak. No, no. You will reveal the truth when you are ready. He turned toward the constable. Mon ami, please fetch me the evidence from the poisoning of Miss Collins. I believe it will help us tie together the threads of this case. The constable nodded and hurried off, leaving the room still heavy with anticipation. Poirot allowed the moment to linger. He could feel the tension rise, the suspects on the edge of their seats, waiting for him to make the next move. But Poirot knew that now was not the time to strike. No, the final piece of the puzzle had yet to be revealed, and he would wait for it patiently, carefully until the moment was right. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. Peace. Stillness in the room was suffocating. Hercule Poirot stood in the center, his eyes calculating. As each suspect felt the weight of his presence, the air had thickened with tension, the underlying fear and desperation now tangible to all. Poirot had uncovered the surface layers of the mystery, but the deeper truths were yet to be fully revealed. The final moves in the game were being made, and someone would soon crack under the pressure. It was only a matter of time before one of the suspects made a mistake. But as Poirot turned to look at them, Devereux, Forsyth, Vandenberg, and the others, he could tell that the situation was shifting. Each of them, though carefully composed on the surface, was hiding something crucial. A soft shuffle of footsteps broke the silence, and Poirot turned to see the constable re-enter the room. The man's face was flushed with urgency, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a small vial of liquid in his hand. Monsieur Poirot, the constable said, his voice laced with unease, we have confirmed the contents of Miss Collins' glass. It contains a rare poisonous substance that works slowly, but surely. Poirot took the vial from the constable, examining it closely. The liquid inside shimmered faintly under the dim light, its clear color almost translucent. Poirot nodded thoughtfully before turning to the group of suspects. And this, Poirot said, holding the vial up for all to see, is the very thing that almost ended Miss Collins' life. A poison, carefully administered, meant to do away with her quietly, without attracting suspicion. But who had access to it? Who knew about its properties? The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to one another. The fear was rising. They had been caught in the web Poirot had carefully spun, and now they were waiting for the noose to tighten. Poirot moved toward Mrs. Forsyth, who stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her body stiff with anxiety. Her composure was faltering now, as it had been throughout the evening. He could see the strain in her eyes. Madame Forsyth, Poirot began, his voice low but firm. You seem concerned. Is it because the poison found in Miss Collins' glass is the same poison you once used? Perhaps it's familiar to you? Mrs. Forsyth's lips pressed together, her breath catching in her throat for a moment. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice tight. But her eyes, her body language, told a different story. She was hiding something, and Poirot could see it. Monsieur Devereux, Poirot said, his voice now shifting toward the businessman. You, too, have been unusually quiet. This poison, it's rare, and you, like Mrs. Forsyth, have connections to people who could have obtained it. Did you know about this? Is it possible that you were involved in procuring it? Devereux shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The glimmer of guilt that had flashed across his face moments ago was still there, hidden just beneath the surface. I had nothing to do with it, he said quickly, his voice defensive. I've already told you, Blythe and I were acquaintances. Nothing more. Poirot didn't believe him. He had learned enough from the man's nervous tics and evasive answers to know that Devereux was hiding something. But there was something more, a deeper connection to the poison, to the web of lies. As Poirot moved on to Clara Vandenberg, he could feel the shift in the room. She was no longer able to maintain the illusion of indifference. Her hands shook ever so slightly as she clasped them together. Her eyes darted between Poirot and the others, clearly torn between defending herself and remaining silent. "You seem unsettled, Madame Vandenberg," Poirot said, his voice quiet but sharp, "and I can't help but notice the way you flinch when I speak of the poison. Do you know something about it? Did you, perhaps, learn about it from Mr. Blythe?" Clara's lips trembled, but she remained silent. She was cracking. Poirot could see it in her eyes. The desperation to hide, to cover up the truth, was written across her face. He could almost hear her thoughts, the weight of guilt pressing down on her chest. Just as Poirot was about to press her further, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the moment. The door to the drawing room burst open, and a figure rushed inside, their expression frantic. It was Vanessa Collins, the woman who had barely survived the poison. Her appearance shocked everyone in the room. She had recovered enough to stand on her own, though she looked pale, her hair disheveled, and her clothes rumpled. The last time they had seen her, she had been on the brink of death. Yet here she was, alive, and with something to say. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice trembling but resolute, "I need to speak with you." The guests turned toward her, their faces a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Poirot, however, remained calm. He knew that she had come for a reason, and he suspected she held the key to unraveling the mystery. "Of course, Miss Collins," Poirot said gently, motioning for her to approach. "What is it that you wish to share?" Vanessa stepped forward slowly, her gaze flicking toward the others in the room. "I know who tried to kill me," she whispered, her voice shaking, "and I know why." The room went silent. The suspects exchanged nervous glances, each of them wondering who would be implicated. Poirot stood, unmoving, his eyes never leaving Vanessa's face. "This," Poirot said softly, "is the moment we have been waiting for." Chapter 14. The final piece falls into Placide's room was still as Vanessa Collins spoke, her trembling voice hanging in the air. Poirot could sense the tension in the room increase exponentially, the weight of her words settling on the group. Each of them stood frozen, their eyes fixed on Vanessa, who was now the focal point of the investigation. Poirot could almost feel the desperate hope and fear swirling around them. Someone, perhaps many, were about to be exposed. Vanessa took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room. "I know who tried to kill me," she repeated, her voice steadier this time. "It wasn't an accident, not a random act. It was planned, and I can tell you who did it." Poirot stepped forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "Please, Miss Collins, we are all listening. The truth, as you say, is at hand. What can you tell us?" She nodded, collecting herself. "I had a conversation with Mr. Blythe earlier that evening, just before dinner. It wasn't the first time we'd spoken, but this time, he seemed different. He was nervous, but not in a way that made sense. He was almost pleading with me. He said there was something he needed to do, something important, and he was afraid he wouldn't get the chance to finish it." Poirot's brow furrowed, his mind already racing. This was new information, critical even. But there was still something unsaid, something hanging in the air. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Vanessa continued. "But then, later that evening, I overheard a conversation between Mr. Blythe and someone else. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough. They were talking about a final plan, something that was going to end the game. And Blythe sounded worried, as if he was about to make a mistake. That's when I knew he wasn't just a businessman. He was involved in something dangerous." Poirot's gaze was sharp. "And did you recognize the other voice, Miss Collins? Who was he speaking to?" Vanessa hesitated, her eyes shifting to the other suspects in the room. I didn't know, but I think it was Devereux. He sounded like he was in charge, like he had control of the situation. At the mention of Devereux's name, a ripple of tension passed through the room. Poirot turned to face the businessman, who was standing near the back, his expression unreadable. Devereux's eyes narrowed at Vanessa's accusation, and for a brief moment, Poirot saw something in his eyes, a flicker of fear, perhaps. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Poirot noticed it. "I'm sorry, but you're mistaken," Devereux said, his voice low and steady. "I had no such conversation with Blythe, and I certainly didn't plot anything with him. This is all speculation, nothing more." Poirot stepped closer to Devereux, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man. "Speculation, you say? But Miss Collins has just told us something that fits the timeline perfectly. She overheard this conversation just before the incident, didn't she? And now we have this." Poirot gestured toward the vial of poison. "The poison that was meant for her." Devereux remained silent, but his eyes flicked to the floor for a brief moment, betraying his discomfort. Poirot had seen enough. The businessman was not being truthful. But now, the final connections are starting to come into focus. Poirot turned back to Vanessa. "Tell me, Miss Collins, did you ever see Mr. Blythe with anything unusual? Anything that could have been the catalyst for this final plan he was speaking of?" Vanessa hesitated before replying. "I didn't see anything directly, but he did seem to be looking over some papers earlier in the day. I remember he was very focused on them, almost as if they were important. He kept them close to him, as though he were afraid of someone finding them." Poirot's mind clicked into place. This was the key. The papers. Blythe had been hiding something that someone else in this room didn't want to get out. And now, it was clear, Blythe's murder was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. He turned toward the constable. "Monsieur, I need you to search Mr. Blythe's room. There must be something there, these papers Miss Collins mentioned. Something that connects all of this together." The constable nodded and hurried off. But Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the suspects. He had no doubt now that the truth was within reach. It was only a matter of time before the final piece fell into place. As the constable left, Poirot turned his attention back to the group, his voice firm and resolute. "It is clear now that there is more at stake than we realized. This is not just a murder investigation. It is a tangled web of secrets and lies. But one thing is certain, the truth is here, hidden in plain sight." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Someone here wanted to keep Mr. Blythe quiet. Someone here was involved in something far more dangerous than any of you have let on. The guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Poirot could feel the room tightening around them. They were no longer in control. The questions they had once asked were now irrelevant. The game had changed. Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming. "You see, the puzzle is almost complete. There is only one question left to answer. Who, among you, has the most to lose?" He let his gaze linger on each suspect, his fingers drumming lightly on his chin. The truth would come. He was certain of it. And when it did, it would expose the guilty party for all to see. Chapter 15. The final gathering room was tense, every eye locked on Poirot as he spoke, each word hanging in the air like a challenge. The clock on the wall ticked, each second a reminder that time was running out. And the truth was close, so close that Poirot could feel it, just beyond his reach, like the final piece of a puzzle that had long since been scattered across the floor. He stood before the suspects, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression calm but watchful. The constable had returned with nothing more than a handful of mundane items, from Blythe's room papers, letters, and trinkets, but none of them held the answers Poirot sought. It was clear to him now. The pieces had been set in motion, and the final act was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot said, his voice quiet but filled with authority, "it is time for the final act of this investigation. We have gathered the clues, examined the motives, and uncovered the secrets that bind us all together. But there is one last question that remains. Who among you is guilty? A ripple of unease passed through the room, but no one spoke. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of anticipation. Poirot's gaze swept over each of them, his mind working furiously to piece together the last fragments of the puzzle. I believe we have already established the connections between you all, Poirot continued, his voice steady. You each have something to hide, something that links you to Mr. Blythe's death. But what is it? What did he know that was so dangerous, so damning, that it warranted his death? The group remained silent, each person seemingly lost in their own thoughts. Poirot could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else, something deeper. They were afraid, yes, but they were also waiting for something. Waiting for Poirot to make the next move. Miss Collins, Poirot said, his voice soft but piercing. You were the one who overheard the conversation between Mr. Blythe and Mr. Devereux. You heard Blythe speak of a final plan, something that would end the game. What was that plan? What was it that he was so afraid of? Vanessa shifted in her seat, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. I don't know everything, she said, her voice shaking. But it was clear to me that Blythe was involved in something more than just business. He was into deep. I think he was trying to back out, trying to get away from something that had already spiraled out of control. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to Devereux. Monsieur Devereux, he said, his voice now cold. You claim to have no involvement in Blythe's death, yet everything points to you. You were the last to speak with him. You had the most to gain from his silence, and you were seen acting suspiciously round the time of the murder. What are we to make of all this? Devereux's jaw tightened, but he did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his expression one of defiance. You're wrong, Poirot, he said, his voice hard. You've been accusing me from the start, but you have no proof. I had nothing to do with his death. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. No proof, you say? What of the invoice found in your possession? What of the rare artifacts that you were involved with? What of the documents Blythe was hiding, documents that linked you to something far more sinister than just business transactions? Devereux flinched slightly, but he quickly recovered. You don't know what you're talking about. I did business with Blythe, yes, but that doesn't mean I killed him. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Poirot took a step closer, his gaze unyielding. I know exactly what I am getting into, Monsieur Devereux, and I know that you are hiding something. The game is over. It is only a matter of time before you reveal yourself. Devereux's face reddened, but before he could respond, Poirot turned his attention to Mrs. Forsyth, who had been silent throughout the exchange. She was sitting with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face impassive, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear that she could not fully conceal. Madame Forsyth, Poirot said softly, you have been unusually calm during this entire investigation. Too calm, in fact. What is it that you are hiding? What do you know about Mr. Blythe's dealings? Mrs. Forsyth's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. I've told you everything I know, Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice cold. I had no personal relationship with Mr. Blythe. I was simply a guest here, nothing more. Poirot's gaze hardened. I don't believe you, madam. You know more than you let on. You have the most to gain from Mr. Blythe's death. Perhaps you are the one who wanted him silenced. Double quotes. Mrs. Forsyth's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. You have no proof, she said sharply, but there was an underlying unease in her voice that Poirot couldn't ignore. Poirot turned his attention to Clara Vandenberg, who had been sitting in silence for much of the evening. Her face was pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and she seemed to be avoiding his gaze. He could see the tension in her posture, the fear that she was trying so desperately to hide. "Madame Vandenberg," Poirot said, his voice gentle but firm, "you have been unusually quiet. I believe you know more than you're letting on. You've been hiding something, haven't you?" Clara's eyes flicked toward Poirot, her lips trembling slightly. I don't know what you mean," she whispered, but her voice was weak, her fear now evident. Poirot leaned in slightly, his voice soft but insistent. "You know exactly what I mean. You've been trying to hide the truth, but you can't escape it any longer." The room fell silent as Poirot turned his gaze back to the group. Each person in the room was now under his watchful eye. He could feel the fear growing, the desperation seeping into their veins. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The truth was coming, and it was coming for them all. Chapter 16. The revealed tension in the room had reached its breaking point. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, carried with it the weight of the truth that had been so carefully hidden. A truth that was now on the verge of being uncovered. Poirot stood at the center, his gaze sweeping over the gathered suspects, each of them on edge, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. The final pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place, and Poirot knew that the moment of revelation was near. Miss Collins, still shaken from her near-death experience, stood by the window, her hands trembling as she looked out at the darkened garden. The others were seated, each of them trapped in the web of suspicion Poirot had woven. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel, the minutes stretching long as Poirot took his time, watching them carefully for a moment. Poirot said nothing. He allowed the tension to hang in the air, building, suffocating, until the pressure became unbearable. Finally, with a small, almost imperceptible sigh, he spoke. "You have all been playing your parts very well," Poirot said, his voice steady and clear. "But the truth cannot remain hidden forever. The game, as they say, is over." The guests shifted in their seats, their faces betraying a mix of fear, guilt, and frustration. Each of them had been caught in Poirot's web, and now there was nowhere left to run. "Monsieur Devereux," Poirot began, his eyes locking onto the businessman, "you have played your role very carefully. You have deflected my questions, tried to hide behind your business dealings. But I believe it is time for you to stop pretending. You knew what Mr. Blythe had discovered, didn't you? And you knew he had to be silenced before he could expose you." Devereux's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing together as if he were preparing to argue. But Poirot's gaze held him, steady and unwavering. "You were involved in far more than just business transactions, monsieur. You were involved in something far darker. You and Blythe were both part of a scheme that went far beyond money, beyond investments. It was about control, about power." Devereux swallowed, his face flushed with anger and fear. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, but Poirot wasn't finished. No. "Monsieur Devereux, I know exactly what I am talking about," Poirot continued, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You had access to information that could have ruined everything you had worked for. And when Blythe found out about it, when he started to threaten you, you knew what had to be done. You had to stop him." Devereux opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his lips. He could see that Poirot was right. His lies were unraveling, and the truth was too powerful to ignore. Poirot turned his gaze to Mrs. Forsyth, who had been sitting quietly, her hands still folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. "And you, Madame Forsyth," Poirot said, his voice softening slightly, though the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "You, too, have been hiding the truth. You were not just a passive observer in this game. You were involved, weren't you?" Mrs. Forsyth stiffened, her face betraying the smallest hint of guilt. "I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Poirot smiled faintly, almost sadly. "Ah, madam, you were not just a bystander. You had your own reasons for wanting Blythe out of the picture. You were connected to him in ways that you have tried very hard to hide. But the truth is that you were one of the few who knew what Blythe had discovered, and that made you a threat to his plan." Mrs. Forsyth's composure faltered, her eyes shifting nervously as she opened her mouth to speak. But before she could respond, Poirot turned to Clara Vandenberg, who had been sitting in silence throughout the entire exchange. "Madame Vandenberg," Poirot said, his voice now even more measured, "you have been the most elusive of all. You have hidden behind your silence, your fear. But I know that you are not as innocent as you claim. You knew about Blythe's death before it happened, didn't you?" Clara's eyes flicked nervously between Poirot and the others. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She was caught. There was nowhere left for her to hide. Poirot took a step closer, his voice quiet but filled with authority. "You were the one who overheard the conversation, madam. You heard Blythe and Devereux discussing the plan to eliminate him. And you knew, deep down, that if you didn't act, you would be next." Clara's face went pale, and for the first time, Poirot saw the fear in her eyes, raw and unfiltered. She was finally breaking, and Poirot could see the weight of her guilt crushing her. "And so, you did what you had to do," Poirot continued, his voice softening, but the intensity still present. "You took matters into your own hands, thinking that by poisoning Miss Collins, you could cover up the truth. But you underestimated one thing, madam. You underestimated me." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she sank back into her chair, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her realization. The truth had come out, and there was no escaping it. Poirot turned to face the rest of the group. "And now, my friends, the game is finished. The truth is out. The murder of Mr. Blythe was not just about business. It was about secrets that each of you wanted to keep buried." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as the reality of Poirot's words sank in. The suspects were now trapped, each of them cornered by their own lies. Poirot smiled, his voice calm and final. "And now, justice will be served." Chapter 17. Outcome and justice. The room was heavy with the silence that followed Poirot's final words. The truth had been revealed, each layer of deception stripped away, exposing the darkness hidden beneath. The suspects, now visibly broken, sat in stunned silence, unable to escape the consequences of their actions. Poirot stood still, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the group with a quiet sense of finality. He had done his work. The pieces had all come together, and now the inevitable was at hand. Justice, Poirot murmured, is not always a simple matter. It is not just about finding the guilty party. It is about ensuring that the truth is laid bare, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Miss Collins, who had been standing at the back of the room, her earlier distress still evident on her face, stepped forward. Her voice was soft but clear as she addressed Poirot. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her words tinged with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened." Poirot nodded politely, his gaze shifting to the constable. "Monsieur, I believe it is time to take the suspects into custody." The constable, his earlier nervousness now replaced with a sense of determination, moved quickly to carry out Poirot's orders. He glanced at the group of suspects, now all fully aware of their fate. None of them resisted as they were led away, their heads bowed in shame. As they filed out of the room, Poirot turned to Vanessa Collins once more. "Miss Collins, I believe you will find your life returning to normal, though it may take time. But remember, justice has been served." Vanessa gave a small, weary smile. "I don't know if normal will ever be the same again," she replied, her voice heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. Poirot's gaze softened, but his expression remained serious. "You will find peace in time. It is the guilty who carry the true burden, not the innocent." With that, The room began to empty. The last of the constables left, and Poirot remained alone in the drawing room, the quiet settling around him. He had solved the case, but the sense of triumph he had once expected was replaced by a quiet reflection. The people involved in this mystery were not just criminals, they were individuals who had made choices that had led them down a dark and irreversible path. As Poirot stood there, contemplating the events that had unfolded, the door to the room creaked open once more. The constable returned, his face a little less tense than before. "Monsieur Poirot," he said with respect, "the suspects are in custody. They will be questioned further, but everything points to them." Poirot nodded, his thoughts already turning to the next mystery, the next challenge. "Thank you, monsieur. And now, we leave the rest to the authorities. I have done what I can. The rest is in their hands." The constable nodded in acknowledgement, and as he left the room, Poirot turned back toward the window, his thoughts drifting once more to the people he had just helped bring to justice. A job well done, yes, but a somber one. The truth, after all, was never as simple as it seemed. It was always more complicated, more tangled, than anyone cared to admit. And for Poirot, the work was never truly over. Chapter 18. The closing remark. The aftermath of the investigation was quiet. The hotel now free of the tense atmosphere that had hung over it for so long. The suspects had been taken into custody, their fate now in the hands of the law. Justice had been served, but as Poirot stood alone in the now silent drawing room, he could not help but feel the weight of the truth settle upon him. The guests had returned to their respective rooms, the party and the mystery both ending, but Poirot remained. It was not in his nature to simply walk away from a case. He stayed behind, as always, to reflect on the people involved, on the minds he had examined, and on the human frailties that had led them to this point. His mind wandered, as it often did, to the strange complexities of human nature, the lies, the hidden motivations, the small decisions that had led people down dark paths. How often did people think they could outsmart the truth? How often did they believe that secrets could stay buried forever? Poirot turned toward the window, watching the moonlight glisten off the lake below. The hotel, once a place of luxury and comfort, now seemed so distant, a mere backdrop to the drama that had unfolded within its walls. But the world would continue, and life would return to its usual pace. The suspects would be processed, and their punishment would follow. He stepped away from the window. Walking toward the door, he paused just for a moment, and then turned to the empty room. A sense of quiet satisfaction washed over him, tempered by the ever-present knowledge that human nature, with all its complexity, would never cease to surprise him. But we must never forget, he mused aloud, speaking to no one in particular. The human heart is full of contradictions, mon ami. It is what makes our work so fascinating. We are all capable of great good, and yet also capable of great evil. He smiled faintly, shaking his head at his own musings. But it is not for me to judge. My task is only to find the truth. As Poirot turned to leave, a soft sound echoed through the hallway, footsteps approaching. He turned, expecting to see the constable, but instead, it was Vanessa Collins, standing at the threshold, looking hesitant but determined. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, her voice still laced with the exhaustion of recent events, "I wanted to thank you personally for everything." Poirot studied her for a moment, his eyes softening. "You have nothing to thank me for, Miss Collins," he replied gently. "You are the one who showed courage, the one who brought the truth to light. It is you who deserves the credit." Vanessa smiled, a faint, weary smile. "I don't think I could have done it without you." Poirot nodded thoughtfully then. With a final glance toward the lake outside, he turned back to her. "We are all connected in ways we do not always understand. But one thing is certain, the truth will always find its way." The lies, the deception, they cannot last forever. There was a long pause as Vanessa absorbed his words. She stepped closer, her eyes still reflecting the emotions of the ordeal. "Will you be leaving soon, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked. Poirot nodded. "Indeed. There is nothing more for me here. The case is closed, and the truth has been revealed." Vanessa looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded. "I hope that wherever you go next, you find peace. You've given me that, at least." Poirot gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Peace, Miss Collins? I am afraid peace is not something I find easily, but I shall try." With that, Vanessa nodded and turned, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Poirot stood still for a moment, watching her go, then turned toward the door. He stepped outside, the cool night air greeting him as he walked toward the waiting car. The case was over, but Poirot knew that his work was never truly finished. There would always be another mystery, another challenge. That was the way of the world. As the car pulled away, Poirot looked out at the night, his mind already drifting to the next puzzle that awaited him. The world was full of mysteries, and Hercule Poirot would always be there to uncover them, one layer at a time. Chapter 19. The final reflection. The journey back to London was long, but Poirot was untroubled by the passage of time. The rolling landscape passed by his window, green fields stretching endlessly, interrupted only by the occasional cluster of trees or a distant farmhouse. But Poirot's mind was not on the scenery outside. It was on the investigation that had just concluded, the tangled web of lies and deceit that had been unraveled. Despite the clarity that came with solving the case, Poirot felt a slight heaviness in his chest. It was not regret nor sorrow, but a quiet reflection on the nature of his work. He had solved many cases, uncovered countless secrets, and yet there was something about this particular case that lingered in his thoughts. Perhaps it was the people involved, the complexity of their motivations, their intertwined fates, or perhaps it was the strange, ever-present idea that human nature, with all its brilliance and flaws, was infinitely more complicated than even he could understand. As the train rumbled on, Poirot's thoughts drifted back to the final moments of the investigation. The suspects had been arrested, their confessions forthcoming, but Poirot knew they would carry their secrets with them. They always did, no matter how much a person was exposed. There were always hidden recesses of the human heart that remained impenetrable. Poirot's gaze shifted to the window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. He studied his own features, the familiar lines of his face. He had been in this line of work for years, and yet he still couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was always at play, just beyond his reach. The criminal mind, so intricate, so layered, never ceased to amaze him. His hand moved to adjust his mustache, a small gesture that grounded him, as if seeking stability in the midst of a storm of thought. It was a small act, a tiny habit, but one that reminded him of his role in the world. He was a detective, yes, but more than that, he was a student of humanity. Every case, every person he encountered, offered him a new lesson, and each lesson left him with a deeper understanding of the human heart. "Mon ami," Poirot murmured softly to himself, as if speaking to the constable who had been with him earlier. "What is it that drives people to such extremes? What forces push them to commit crimes, to hide their guilt, to weave lies so thick that even they believe them?" He sighed quietly, leaning back in his seat. The case of Blythe and the poisonings had been one of manipulation, greed, and fear, but it had also been one of trust, betrayal of it, and the deep, dark consequences of severing it. The suspects, each with their own motives, had been tied together not by a single thread, but by their common desire to control their own fates, and in doing so, they had sealed their doom. The train continued its journey, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a steady reminder of the passage of time. Poirot had come to terms with the resolution of the case. He had revealed the guilty party, exposed their lies, and ensured that justice would prevail. The murderer, the accomplices, they would all face the consequences of their actions. But that didn't erase the deeper questions, the ones that lingered long after the case had closed. What was the true nature of evil? Was it merely the product of circumstances, or was it something inherent in human nature, waiting to be triggered? Could a person, having once crossed the line, ever truly return to the path of righteousness? These were the questions that kept Poirot up at night, not the ones about who had done what and why. Those answers he could find. The human soul, however, was a far more complex thing. Poirot looked at his watch and noted that the train would soon be arriving in London. He had resolved cases like this before, and he would no doubt solve more in the future. But there was something uniquely unsettling about this one, something that stirred in his mind long after the suspects had been arrested. Perhaps it was the idea that the truth, while powerful, could only go so far. People had their reasons, their justifications, their secrets, and no matter how many crimes he solved, Poirot knew he would never fully understand them. There was always another layer, another truth hidden just beneath the surface. The mind of a criminal, he had learned, was a labyrinth with no final exit. The puzzle might be solved, but the maze would always remain. The train slowed as it approached the station, and Poirot sat up straight, gathering his belongings. He was, after all, a man of action. The thoughts that lingered in his mind would have to wait. For now, his work was done. The case was closed out as the train pulled into the station. Poirot stood and made his way toward the door. He stepped onto the platform, the cool air of London greeting him with a familiar embrace. It was a city of secrets, a city that thrived on the ebb and flow of mystery. But Poirot was never deterred. He would find his answers no matter how long it took, no matter how many layers of deception he had to peel back. With a final glance around the station, Poirot smiled softly to himself. There was always another case, always another mystery, and he, Hercule Poirot, would be there to solve it.